There's a kind of horror that doesn't go away when you close the book or leave the theater. It follows you home, it comes back at 3 a.m. when you can't sleep, and it's still there a year later, sometimes longer. I've been thinking a lot about what makes that kind of horror work, and what most horror writers get wrong when they try to write it. The horror that lasts shares usually 7 key structural qualities. None of them are about how scary the monster looks, none of them are about how loud the music gets. They're about something more, something underneath. Let's get into it. Welcome back to the Wrestling with Words podcast. My name is Cameron. I'm a writer and editor and your host. Here we talk about all things related to writing and storytelling. And the goal is to help you tell better stories while also understanding how the best stories are told. Horror attracts people for a lot of different reasons. I'm not going to pretend that there isn't something cathartic about a well-timed jump scare or the tension of watching a slasher pick characters off one by one. Sometimes a campy horror movie is just a campy horror movie. That's fine. But there's a reason you can forget a jump scare within minutes of leaving the theater and carry certain horror stories with you for years. In a 2018 Newsweek interview, Junji Ito put it this way. I grew up with the old-timey Hammer and Universal horror movies, which focused more on creating a scary mood. So I preferred movies that gradually scare the audience with eerie atmosphere. Jump scares can certainly make people scared in the moment, but it's a sort of fleeting fear. Fleeting fear is the thing to really consider. Dread, on the other hand, is something else. Dread is sustained, the feeling of what's coming before it arrives and what it means after it passes. Shock is an atmosphere, while dread is an atmosphere you build to be really considered. In Dead Space, you play as Isaac Clarke, a starship engineer set to investigate the silent mining vessel USG Ishimura. What he finds is a ship overrun by necromorphs, reanimated, mutated human corpses, basically space zombies, but a lot more spindly. The game has plenty of jump scares and body horror, but it understands that the sustained dread you feel is more frightening than any individual ambush. The developers literally named their dynamic audio system the Fear Emanator. What it does is it tracked the player's proximity to threats and shaped the soundscape in real time, just to startle you, but to make sure you were never not afraid. The necromorphs don't leap out at you from nowhere. The ship constantly groans, the lights flicker, and you hear something move before you actually see it. But the dread isn't only atmospheric, it's tied to what Dead Space is actually about. Isaac isn't just hunting necromorphs, he's slowly losing his mind. The Maker, the alien artifact that started all of this, is reaching into Isaac's grief over his dead girlfriend Nicole, hallucinating her into the corridors, whispering through the static. The dread the player feels mirrors what Isaac feels as a character. The creeping certainty that something is wrong with him, not just with the ship. The Ishimura is haunted just as much as Isaac's own psyche. And another great example that does this is in the film I Saw the TV Glow, which commits to this entirely. We don't get jump scares or any cathartic monster reveal. The horror is the suffocation of a life that doesn't fit, and the film's refusal to resolve the question of what's real compounds with its themes. The dread isn't out in the world, it's instead inside the protagonist. It's a structural intention that's in every scene, showcasing and embodying the idea relating to the dread of losing yourself or a close friend to disassociation. Applying a feeling of dread does not have to be done only in the horror genre. Consider this. Where is the dread in this individual scene? Not the danger, not the thematic dread, the kind that requires a specific distance from the threat. A tense moment that the reader feels, but the character can't quite name. But dread alone isn't enough. A ticking time bomb creates dread. A rising sea level creates dread. And neither of those are necessarily horror. The difference is in what exactly is being threatened. Generic danger creates generic fear. Horror works, and really works, when what's being threatened is specific to the protagonist. This can be their identity, their relationships, their sanity, their body, or their deepest source of guilt or flaw. In a 2018 interview about Hereditary, Ari Aster was asked what scared him. He said, "I'm afraid of dying alone. I'm afraid of being responsible for something horrible happening to somebody I love and then not being forgiven. I'm afraid of somebody in my family turning on me." Notice, though, what he didn't say. He didn't name a specific monster. He didn't name some kind of event. Every fear he listed was specific, relational, and possibly, and more importantly, without remedy. You can't outrun being unforgiven, and you can't survive your way out of a family member turning on you. Where danger has a remedy, fear, the kind that really lasts, doesn't. In the book No Longer Human, it isn't necessarily marketed as horror, but it does function as probably one of the best examples of psychological horror in literature. The protagonist isn't threatened by anything external. He's threatened by the possibility of being fully known and the essential wrongness of being seen by other people. The threat is specific to him in a way that no external monster could really match. He carries it into every room. And we should notice that the horror isn't that everyone is necessarily coming from. Instead, the horror is that he is already inside the thing he can't escape. In Blasphemous, the miracle doesn't threaten everyone equally. The game's horror is specifically calibrated around Catholic guilt and a culture that has made suffering sacred. The penitent one carries a sword that absorbs the guilt of others, which means the entire world he moves through becomes a mirror of his own spiritual condition. Thematically, and I would argue narratively as well, the threat isn't the monsters necessarily. The threat is what the monsters represent about faith, punishment, and self. This setting wouldn't be a horrifying place for any other protagonist. It is uniquely horrifying exactly for this one. And coming back to Ari Aster, we can look at Midsommar, where he demonstrates his own principle. The cult that the protagonist finds herself in wouldn't necessarily work on any other kind of protagonist. It works on Dani because she is grief-hollowed and relationally starved in exactly the way the commune fills. The horror is uniquely tailored to her wound. A different woman who had different experiences would have been able to walk away. But in this case, Dani stays, unable to leave. Before you build your threat, build your protagonist's specific vulnerability. What do they love that can be taken? What do they fear about themselves that can be exposed? Whatever form your monster takes, it should feel like it was made specifically for them. But even the most personally calibrated threat won't land if the audience hasn't first been made clear about what exactly is being lost. Which means you have to show them a world or an object that might be worth losing. You cannot violate normalcy without first establishing it. The more real, specific, and grounded the world is before the kind of horror arrives, the more devastating the arrival. Stephen King makes this case in Dane's Macabre. He calls it the Apollonian vision, the ordered, rational world that horror comes to shatter. The ordered, rational world has nothing to break if the Apollonian was never real and understood. We can look at Mike Flanagan's adaptation of The Haunting on House Hill, where we spend a lot of the first episode getting to know the family on a sort of fundamental level. Each sibling is reintroduced as an adult, carrying the weight of a childhood they refuse to revisit, and the show grounds you in the adult version specifically. The messy, recognizable architecture of trying to be a functional person while something unprocessed brews. Then, after all of that is established, the horror reasserts itself, and when it does, it doesn't just threaten the characters, it dismantles the lives those characters built to survive, their original wound. The grief is heavy because the ordinary was earned first. In Get Out, It shows us that the ordinary world doesn't have to mean tranquility and that it can be socially performed. Chris's weekend at the estate is full of normal interactions. Wine on the porch, a backyard party, polite questions from white liberals, who are the focus group that are being deconstructed in this film. And every one of those interactions is doing two things at once. The ordinary is the horror, slowed down to a pace where the audience can recognize it before the protagonist does. By the time the sunken place arrives, the rupture isn't taking us from normal to terrifying. It's from almost normal to finally honest about what was always right there. And then there is The Stand by Stephen King, where King spends roughly 250 pages on the ordinary world before Captain Tripp kills 99% of the global population. Now, I don't recommend or endorse in any way to spend the entire length of some novels just to set up the ordinary world. But this is Stephen King after all, and he can kind of do whatever he wants. But what's interesting is what those 250 pages actually do for the story. We establish Stu's small town Texas life, Fran Goldsmith's kitchen argument with her mother, and Larry Underwood's New York come down. These become the main subjects that's about to be flipped entirely upside down. The apocalypse works because the ordinary world was specific enough to feel like something is truly lost, as opposed to just an ordinary backstory given to us. The biggest thing to do is to resist the impulse to get to the horror too quickly. This is a little bit counterintuitive to some advice, but try not to think of the ordinary world as padding or setup. It should be an important part of the story with its own interesting hook and narrative flow. It's also important that the more specific you've built what exists before the horror arrival, the harder it will hit when everything descends into madness. But ordinary worlds can be violated and then escaped. Horror needs more. It needs to make sure that even after the rupture, the protagonist can't just run away from what's arrived. I think one of the things that breaks horror immersion the most and the fastest is almost the moment when the audience starts asking why the characters don't just leave. When horror works, the answer to that question is never because they're stupid or because the plot demands you just don't ask that question. Instead, it's because the specific nature of the threat makes the escape impossible for deeply personal or thematic reasons. Sometimes physical reasons too, but more often something else. In Dan Simmons' The Terror, dread and horror are directly sustained by inescapability. The Franklin expedition is trapped in the Arctic ice, but the physical trap is only part of it. The creatures stalking the ships, the hunting polar bears, the scurvy that's ripping through the crew, and the lead poisoning seeping out of their canned food are arguably all manifestations of the crew's colonial arrogance and collective flaws. The ice will eventually thaw, but the thematic truths underneath won't. They didn't bring the horror to the Arctic. They brought the conditions that made the horror inevitable. And on the ice, there is no escaping the things that hunt them. In Pathologic 2, you play as a doctor in a dying town, and the game's rules are pitiless and consistent. Time passes whether you intervene or not. Resources dwindle, people die when you're elsewhere. You could, in theory, just sort of walk away. Nothing physical traps you in the town. What makes it horror rather than just a difficult set of gameplay challenges is that you have to stay. Not because you can't leave geographically, but because the moral weight of leaving is impossible. The inescapability is more of an ethical thing. The game knows you can leave and refuses to make it easy for you to do so. And then there is It Follows, where the inescapability is built into the rules of this threat. The entity walks and never stops. It's always coming, and the characters can't run, swim, drive, or flee in any sort of way. And this is because it knows where you are because it's bound to you. The horror isn't trapped in a single location. You are instead the location. Wherever you go, it will follow, and the threat will be there. What specifically makes it impossible for your protagonist to leave or call for help? If the answer is bad luck or circumstance, dig a little bit deeper to this question. The best answers are usually personal. They can't leave because of who they are, what they've done, or sometimes what they love. So the protagonist can't leave. The threat is personal. The ordinary world has been established and violated. But here's where a lot of horror makes the next mistake. It often shows you too much and too soon. I have mentioned this book a lot, but David Peake in The Spectacle of the Void argues that horror is the art form closest to the unrepresentable, that it communicates the gap between what the reader knows and doesn't know. And what the reader imagines will almost always be worse than whatever you show them. Horror often emerges from the lack of information, from the void of information that the mind insists on filling. In the Southern Reach trilogy, Area X is never fully explained. What it is, where it came from, and what exactly it wants. None of these questions are truly answered. Theories are floated out there. Characters begin to propose explanations, and the second book even introduces the Southern Reach Agency itself, which exists to answer these questions and has spent decades failing. Instead, what is given you is the experience of moving through something that operates by logic you can almost grasp, but never quite hold. The horror is epistemological. Reality itself becomes unreliable, and the dread takes on a cosmic scale. Not because the threat is huge, but because the category the threat belongs to keeps slipping between levels of comprehension and lack of comprehension. Bloodborne's entire progression mechanic is built around this principle. Insight is the currency you spend to understand the game's world. But insight makes things worse, not better. The more you know about the Great Ones, the more frightening they become. New enemies become visible at higher levels of insight, and the lecture halls start reacting to your presence. The game mechanically enforces the idea that knowledge deepens dread rather than resolves it, building the idea that understanding is the trap here. And then there is Uzumaki, which runs for hundreds of pages, the manga, without ever explaining the spiral curse tormenting people. It compounds, mutates, and spreads. People become spirals, the towns become spirals, and the geography itself begins to twist. And the logic of any of it never really is rationalized. The horror accumulates because of its refusal to provide an answer. The author, Ito, understands that a single panel of a person turning into a spiral, unexplained, will haunt the reader longer than any explanation ever could. When you reach the moment in your draft where you are about to explain the monster or some aspect of the horror, pause for a moment. Ask whether the explanation earns more than the mystery costs. Most of the time, the answer is no. I always think of this as sort of the Jaws example. The fin in the water is always more frightening than that final scene when Jaws is in the boat trying to eat the sailors. But there is a transition worth naming. Restraint isn't the same thing as arbitrariness. Withholding information doesn't mean the rule doesn't exist. The known should feel unknown as opposed to random or underdeveloped. Arbitrary horror feels cheap. Even the most irrational, inexplainable monsters should follow some kind of internal logic. Robert Eggers, in an interview about The Witch, talked about this directly. He built the film's horror to operate exactly as 17th century Puritans believed their world operated. The witch is real, the devil keeps his bargain, and the line between fairy tale and reality wasn't ever there. Eggers put it this way in that interview. If they called you a witch back then, they really believed that you were a fairy tale ogre capable of doing things that the witch in my film does. The real world and the fairy tale world were the same thing in the early modern period. And this is what really earns the film's ending. The rules of the witch aren't modern rules dressed up in sort of a period piece costume. They're the actual world of these people inside the story. The monster in The Outsider operates by a logic that should be impossible, but it still has its own restraints and rules. The creature can be in two places at once. It feeds on grief and it leaves traces behind. Every rule established early is honored, and the horror stacks upon itself as those rules get tested against the investigator's rational worldviews. Story doesn't ask the audience to accept the rules are real. It instead asks them to follow what happens when smart people refuse to. In Soma's horror is more philosophical rather than something physical, but its rules are clear from the start. The central terror, the question of what consciousness is after digital transfer, and whether the version of you that wakes up is the you or a copy. It follows the premise established in the opening hour and then pursues them to their logical conclusion. The fact that the horror was more foreshadowing and remained open-ended at the end of the game is what makes it so impactful. You can't dismiss the ending because the game has already sort of shown you over and over how its rules work. At the end of the day, it's up to you to decide what exactly happened to Simon and the copy-paste reality of the arc. Write the rules that are necessary to understand before actually delving into the horror itself. Think of it the way you might think of a magic system or world-building rule sets. What can it do? What can't it do? What does it want? More often than not, the limits will become more interesting than the unstructured terror. If you can't answer those questions, the audience will feel that disconnect, even if they can't necessarily name it. So, the horror has dread. It's personal, it violates the ordinary world, it traps the protagonist, it restrains its revelations, and it now has rules to follow. All of these are components, the sort of mechanics of what makes horror work. But there's one more thing that separates horror that disturbs you for a moment from horror that haunts you well after the story is finished. In the book Philosophy of Horror, it is argued that what distinguishes horror as a genre is a specific emotional response to monsters that violate natural categories. Things that shouldn't exist but do. But the horror that lasts, the horror that really works, goes further than violating those categories. The monster is always a metaphor, whether the writer intends it or not. Mike Flanagan wrote about this directly in a 2021 essay about Midnight Mass, in which he described the show's central horror as being built on his worst, most ingrained anxiety. Not the fear of dying from alcoholism, but the fear of killing someone else while drunk and living with it after. The vampire on the island doesn't separate from that fear. It is that fear, but now with fangs. When horror maps onto something real and inescapable, something the audience carries with them from the story is in their hands or not. It does what no other genre really can. And this is why we see so many genres take elements of horror and include them in their own. The cult in Hereditary is the danger. Amion, the rituals, the conspiracy, these are all just parts of the plot. But the fear, the thing the film is actually about, is inherited trauma. The terror that your family made you into something before you ever had the chance to choose otherwise. The question Hereditary is really asking isn't will they survive? It's can you escape what your family made you? The question has no clean answer. The film's monster wears the costume of a demonic cult, but what it does to its protagonist is what generational trauma does to anyone who inherits it. It strips them of the illusion of authority over their own life. The cult is the metaphor's vehicle, while the trauma is the metaphor materialized. In the Ballad of Black Tom, it is a retelling of Lovecraft's The Horror at Red Rock, from the perspective of a black character navigating 1920s Harlem. The cosmic horror is the same as any Lovecraftian story. the indifference of the universe, sleeping gods, occult rituals, all of it. But in this book, it makes a specific argument. Cthulhu's indifference is less terrifying than the white supremacy Tom faces, which is active, intentional, and structured. The horror here represents something. It is also a direct criticism of Lovecraft and the original story that he wrote, and the worldview that he sort of had. The otherworldly monsters are just a mirror, and what they reflect is far worse than what they are. And finally, Disco Elysium isn't traditionally categorized as horror. Harry Du Bois wakes up at his lowest point imaginable. A detective who drank himself into amnesia to escape a version of himself that he hates and the memory of a love he lost. The horror isn't supernatural as much as it is ideological. The world of Revachol is a ruin because every political century it lived through has collapsed. Harry is a ruin because the ideology he believes in collapsed. The monster in Disco Elysium is history and the trauma of failed systems that will continue to fail. Ask yourself this: what is my horror actually about? Not the plot, but the theme. What human fear, what social condition, what unspoken anxiety does the monster embody? What does survival, or the failure to survive, mean thematically? The horror doesn't need to be allegorical in any obvious way, but it does need to be about something. Which all of this brings us back to where we started. Most horror fails because writers create danger when they should be creating fear. Danger is external, actionable, and resolvable. Fear, on the other hand, is internal, thematic, and sometimes inescapable. You can survive danger. Fear you can only really understand. And after you understand it, you cannot unknow it. These 7 things aren't necessarily a checklist. They're not rules you apply mechanically to a draft. They're a way of thinking about what horror is. Dread instead of shock, a threat that is personal to the protagonist, an ordinary world worth grieving, an inescapability that's psychological, not physical, restraint as a technique, consistent internal logic, and underneath all of it, meaning. The thing the horror is actually about. None of these things only applies to horror writers. If you're writing dark fantasy, science fiction, psychological thrillers, or anything with a serious thematic weight, these principles still may apply. The genre label on the cover doesn't change what makes dread land. Horror at its best doesn't just frighten you. It makes you understand something you didn't want to understand before. And once you understand it, you can never unknow it.